Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
My dad gave my sister a $10,000 bonus just for existing 2 months after I got promoted to VP, and he didn't even say congrats. So I stopped speaking, not out of anger, just to see what would happen. It happened on a Thursday, and for some reason, that sticks with me. Thursdays used to be my favorite day of the week, close enough to Friday that the energy in the office would pick up a little. People weren't dragging like they were on Monday, or scrambling like they did on Wednesdays. It was a day where things got done. And that Thursday, I was fresh off the highest high I'd had in 10 years of working for my family's company. We were a regional distribution company based in Ohio, mid-sized, specialized in hardware, HVAC, and parts nobody thinks about unless something breaks. Not glamorous, but solid. My dad, Doug, started it in the 80s and built it from the ground up with nothing but grit and a borrowed pickup truck. He loved to remind us about the borrowed pickup truck part, especially when he felt like we weren't working hard enough. I had worked every job there was in that business. Started at the front desk answering phones, then moved into dispatch, then warehouse management, customer service, sales coordination, vendor relations. You name it, I'd done it. I didn't cut corners, I didn't ask for favors. In fact, I made it a point never to mention I was the boss's daughter in any meeting, internal or external. And when I finally got that promotion, Vice President of Operations, it wasn't a ceremonial title. It was earned, clawed through late nights, holiday weekends, and putting out 100 little fires that my dad didn't even know existed. My name was on contracts, on expansion reports, on key vendor agreements. I didn't need his approval by then, but maybe I still wanted it. I remember walking into his office that Thursday with a smile so wide it hurt. HR had finally made it official after the board signed off. I was now the youngest VP in the company's history, and I wanted to share that with the one person who'd built the place from the ground up. He was eating a ham sandwich at his desk, reading one of those old-school printed trade journals he still subscribed to. I said, "Hey, it's official, I got it." He looked up for a split second, nodded, and said, "All right, just don't let it get to your head." That was it. No handshake, no good job, not even a smirk. I walked out of there telling myself it didn't matter, that I didn't do it for his praise, that I was too old to still be chasing the same bone I'd been trying to fetch since I was 10 years old. I told myself all of that, and maybe I even believed it. For about 7 weeks. Then came the real kicker. We were at one of those monthly all-hands meetings where we try to make the company feel less like a machine and more like a community. Doug usually opened with numbers. I gave the operations updates, and sometimes Ashley, my younger sister, would give some marketing fluff about brand development or social engagement. She had joined the company a year earlier and had been working maybe 10 to 15 hours a week, mostly remote, mostly at cafes with oat milk lattes and her dog sitting in a designer bag. She had ideas, lots of them, and they were mostly ridiculous or expensive. But Doug loved her enthusiasm, said she had vision, said it like it was a special skill no one else in the company had. That day, Doug stood up at the end of the meeting and made an announcement that he said was from the heart. He said he wanted to recognize someone who had brought light and energy to the company, someone whose creativity and optimism reminded him of the early days. I already knew where it was going, but I didn't expect the dollar amount. He handed Ashley an envelope and said, "Just a little something, 10,000 for everything you do and how much you care." The room clapped. I stood there smiling like an idiot while my insides boiled. And Ashley? She did that half scream, half giggle she always did, jumped up and hugged him like she was 5 again and said, "You're the best, Dad." Later that day, I walked back into my office and shut the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I just sat there and looked at the stack of reports I'd been reviewing, the staffing spreadsheet I'd built from scratch, the expansion projections I'd revised after catching a critical vendor pricing error Ashley had missed. I looked at everything I'd done. And then I looked at nothing. For the first time in years, I let the silence in. and it was kind of peaceful. That night, I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and left my laptop in my bag. I didn't respond to Ashley's text. OMG, wasn't that cute? Or my dad's email asking for a draft of the updated schedule. I went to sleep early. When I woke up, I made coffee, got dressed, and went to work. But I didn't say good morning to anyone. When Ashley popped into my office to tell me she was thinking of launching a company TikTok, I just nodded. When my dad called me into a strategy meeting, I said I was unavailable and would email my notes. I didn't. When he called me twice that evening, I let it ring. I didn't plan to go silent. I didn't do it to punish them. It was more like a curiosity. What would happen if I just stopped showing up emotionally? If I stopped trying so hard to matter? I wanted to see how long it would take before they noticed I was gone, even while still sitting in front of them. Turns out, it didn't take long at all. And what happened next made the bonus feel like nothing. I wish I could say the silence started as a grand plan. Some kind of carefully calculated emotional strategy meant to pull attention and make a point. But the truth is, it began the same way so many of my decisions do. With exhaustion so deep, it didn't even feel like fatigue anymore, just a kind of quiet resignation that settled in my bones and whispered that I didn't need to explain myself to people who only heard what they wanted. I didn't wake up that Friday morning and vow not to speak. I just realized I had nothing left I felt like offering, and the thought of pretending one more time, of pasting a smile on my face and laughing at a joke Ashley didn't even understand, felt like more betrayal than silence ever could. At work, I kept everything strictly professional, and by that I mean I didn't offer any words beyond what was absolutely required for the business to keep functioning. My calendar stayed full, back-to-back logistics reviews, procurement calls, HR updates, but I said only what was necessary. I stopped popping into people's offices to check in, stopped offering unsolicited help or late-night follow-up emails with just one more thing to consider. I showed up. I did the job. But the part of me that used to go above and beyond, the part that used to pick up after everyone else's half-efforts like some dutiful second mother, that part was done. Ashley noticed first, of course, but not in the way you might expect. She didn't come in concerned or curious. She came in performative as usual, smiling in that overly rehearsed way she had, holding her phone half raised like she might go live at any moment, and said, "Hey, you've been kinda quiet this week. Everything good?" I looked at her, nodded once, and turned back to my screen without saying a word. Her smile twitched just a little, that millisecond of confusion flashing behind her eyes before she bounced out with some throwaway comment about how we all need to unplug sometimes. She probably posted something about mental health 5 minutes later, hashtagged it to death, and never thought about it again. But Dad was different. He wasn't dumb, just oblivious in a way that only comes from decades of power and people who never pushed back. At first, I think he thought I was sulking, that I'd come crawling back for his approval or make some emotional plea to be recognized. But when 3 days passed and I still hadn't acknowledged him beyond a professional noted or attached please see, he started to falter. He would peek into my office with questions he already had the answers to, asking for clarification on things he could have found in a 2-minute search or simply by reading the documents I'd sent him. I gave him what he needed, without the extra commentary, without the friendly tone, without anything more than what was required. That's when I realized something important. My silence wasn't passive, it was power. When you take away what people expect from you, especially when you've been giving it freely for so long, they start to unravel. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I didn't argue or demand. I just removed myself from the emotional labor of the relationship. And the space left behind was louder than anything I could have shouted. Meetings felt colder, memos shorter, moods tenser, and still, I said nothing. The real shift came about a week in, when I accidentally overheard a conversation that confirmed everything I'd always suspected, but never truly wanted to believe. I was in the copy room, waiting for the printer to unjam, again, and their voices came through the wall from the adjoining office. Ashley's voice was its usual sing-song, half laughing as she said, I think Liv's mad about the bonus thing, like, really mad. Should I talk to her or just let it blow over? Dad sighed, that weary, patronizing sigh he used when he thought he was being rational and wise, and said, Olivia's always been like that. She gets stuck in her head. Always needed more attention than you. She works hard, sure, but she just can't seem to let things go. Let her pout. She'll come back when she's ready. He said it like I was a child, like the 10 years I'd spent building up his empire meant less than Ashley showing up twice a week with a mood board for a fake ad campaign. Like I was an emotional burden, not a strategic partner. I didn't move, I didn't cry, I didn't slam anything. I just stood there in that fluorescent lit room with the jammed printer and let it land. And then, with a calm I still don't quite understand, I pulled out my phone and hit record. I didn't know what I'd do with it. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I knew in that moment that if they saw me as the emotional one, the needy one, the problem child, then maybe it was time I leaned into that expectation in a way they never saw coming. The silence became intentional after that. Not petty, not manipulative, strategic. I began saying no to meetings unless they were critical. I rerouted all Ashley's internal requests through her assistant, who now had to submit formal documentation just like everyone else. I stopped staying late to clean up the messes left behind by our creative team, which was mostly Ashley and her best friend who knew nothing about metrics, but a lot about fonts. I stopped laughing at my dad's outdated jokes in board meetings. I stopped attending family dinners under the guise of late deadlines or migraines or anything else that didn't require me to explain how I was actually just tired of pretending to be part of a family that didn't even notice when I disappeared emotionally. The real beauty of silence is how unnerving it is to people who rely on your reaction to feel justified. They didn't know how to respond to me not responding. They poked, they tested, they tried guilt and confusion, and finally, vague attempts at concern. But I gave them nothing. And while they scrambled to figure out what was going on, I paid attention, really paid attention for the first time in years. I noticed how many little things Ashley left undone, how often her mistakes were swept under the rug by people too afraid to question her proximity to power. I noticed how many decisions Dad was making without reviewing full data, relying instead on instinct that had grown stale in a market that moved too fast for gut feelings. I noticed how much of the business relied on my work, my systems, my spreadsheets, my people, and I started to ask myself a quiet, dangerous question. If I were to really leave, not just emotionally, but completely, what would happen to them? What would this place look like if I stopped holding it together? That's when the gears in my head started turning in a way they hadn't before. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. If they didn't value what I gave freely, maybe it was time they learned how much it would cost to replace me. And that thought, that tiny little shift in perspective, was the moment the real plan began. The irony didn't hit me all at once. It unfolded gradually, like the slow peel of old wallpaper, revealing something uglier underneath. Something that had been hidden for years, but was never really gone. Just ignored long enough to blend into the background. For most of my adult life, I thought I had accepted my place in the family structure. Thought I'd figured out how to navigate the ever-shifting expectations of being the reliable one, the serious one, the daughter who never asked for much but always delivered. I thought that by keeping my head down and working twice as hard, I'd carved out my own version of respect. The kind that didn't need fireworks or speeches or, God forbid, $10,000 bonuses. But in the days following my silence, when the air around me began to shift and small cracks formed in the image they had of me, I realized how much power I'd been leaving on the table for years, handing it over piece by piece every time I covered for a mistake, smoothed over a confrontation, or let my sister take credit for something I'd orchestrated in the shadows. And when I saw how uncomfortable they were with my silence, not just annoyed, not just confused, but genuinely unsettled, I knew I had reached a turning point. The kind of turning point that doesn't come with a big announcement or dramatic outburst, but instead begins with a slow burn, a quiet kind of rebellion that starts with closing a door just a little more firmly than usual and ends with flipping the whole foundation upside down. I didn't want to destroy the company. That's never how this started. I just wanted them to feel what it was like to live without the version of me they had grown so used to abusing. So I began with the smallest, most passive-looking of changes, the kind no one notices at first, but eventually makes people start questioning if something's been off the whole time. The company website had been recently redesigned by Ashley's branding team, which was mostly a bunch of her influencer friends who dabbled in Canva and used phrases like elevate the aesthetic. Buried deep in the About Us section, they'd given Ashley the title of Chief Creative Officer, a title no one had ever approved or discussed in any board meeting. So I went into the CMS, removed her title, deleted the unnecessary bio they'd written, comparing her to modern disruptors like Sophia Amoruso and Gwyneth Paltrow, and replaced it with a simple factual entry. Ashley Martin, Marketing Associate. No title inflation, no hyperbole, just reality. It took less than 3 minutes. Next came the budget reallocations. Every quarter, our departments submit needs assessments and operating budgets. And for years, I had been quietly shifting funds from overstuffed vanity projects to critical logistics and back-end systems that kept us running. Ashley's team always asked for too much, for studio rentals, influencer outreach, travel to irrelevant conferences. And I'd always approved at least some of it just to keep the peace. But this time, I didn't. I redirected her travel budget to warehouse overtime compensation. I canceled the upcoming photo shoot for our non-existent lifestyle blog and instead replaced 3 malfunctioning delivery tablets that had been limping along for months. When Ashley's assistant emailed asking about the missing funds, I replied with one sentence. Budget priorities have shifted to align with operational needs. No explanation, no justification, just the truth. By the second week of my quiet revolution, people in the office began to notice, not because I said anything, but because systems were suddenly smoother, decisions more logical, and priorities finally made sense. Warehouse leads who hadn't gotten a raise in 2 years suddenly had the resources to fix the problems they'd been duct taping for months. Our shipping team hit their monthly metrics for the first time in 3 quarters, and all the while, Ashley kept flailing, confused about why her initiatives weren't landing and why vendors were suddenly refusing to schedule brainstorming calls without proper agendas. The best part was how professional it all looked from the outside. I didn't lash out. I didn't throw anyone under the bus. I simply stopped making it easy for people to coast on nonsense. I let the gaps show themselves. And every time someone tried to raise a question, I offered them a paper trail. Emails, timestamps, receipts. Everything documented. Everything defensible. It was a kind of clean vengeance I hadn't known I was capable of, and it felt better than any screaming match ever could. The real confirmation that things were shifting came during one of our internal strategy reviews. Normally, these meetings were held by Dad, with Ashley offering occasional buzzword-heavy contributions while I sat with my spreadsheets and spoke only when asked. But that morning, Dad was late, Ashley was unprepared, and I was done waiting, so I started. I walked the department heads through the quarterly projections, highlighted efficiencies gained from recent decisions, and casually noted the budget realignments as approved operational shifts. When Dad finally walked in, he looked surprised, maybe even a little disoriented, but he didn't interrupt. He just sat down, silent, and listened. Later that day, I received an email from him. Subject line, lunch? Just one word. Not a question, really. More like a peace offering from someone who wasn't sure what war they were in. I didn't respond, not because I was trying to punish him, but because I didn't see the point. What were we going to talk about? The daughter he rewarded for doing less? The one who got applauded for existing while I carried the weight of 3 departments and made it look easy? There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in every shrug, every overlooked contribution, every good job that was never offered. Ashley tried a different approach. She popped into my office 2 days later with 2 iced coffees and a forced smile, saying she thought we should talk. I thanked her for the coffee but told her I had back-to-back meetings. She stood there for a second, waiting for me to look up or crack or offer some hint that I still cared. I didn't. When she left, I dumped the coffee in the trash, not out of spite, just because I didn't want it. Every step I took was small enough to be dismissed by someone not paying attention, but together they built a structure of control I hadn't held before. Not control out of fear or manipulation, but out of competence. The more I stepped back emotionally, the more everyone started realizing just how much I had been holding together. And slowly the balance began to shift. Not because I demanded it, but because they couldn't function without it. The funniest part? No one had confronted me yet. Not really. They were too unsure of themselves, too afraid to say the wrong thing, too used to me smoothing everything over. And that fear, however mild, however quiet, was the first real power I'd ever held over them. Not because I wanted to dominate them, but because for the first time, they didn't know what I was thinking. And that silence? That was my favorite part, because it meant I finally had their attention. If there's one thing I've learned after spending more than a decade in a family business, especially one run by a patriarch who built everything from scratch and now guards it like a fortress made entirely of ego, it's that the real collapse doesn't start with some loud, dramatic explosion like in the movies. It begins slowly, quietly, and in the most mundane places imaginable. A missed email, an ignored calendar invite, a logistics report no one bothers to read until the numbers are off and the customer service line lights up like a Christmas tree. It starts when people who aren't used to being questioned begin to feel the first tremors of uncertainty, when the systems they took for granted suddenly don't respond the way they always have, when the people they've relied on without acknowledging begin to withdraw, not with threats, but with indifference. And by the time the warning signs become impossible to ignore, it's usually too late to stop the foundation from crumbling beneath their feet. That week began like any other, at least on the surface. The office lights still flickered on at 7, the coffee in the break room was still terrible, and Doug still walked in like he owned the air we breathed, which, to be fair, he kind of did. But something was different, and everyone felt it. The tension was no longer subtle or ambiguous. It had become visible, almost physical, hanging in the office like humidity before a storm. People spoke in lowered tones, paused before hitting reply all, and glanced over their shoulders just a little more often than usual. And at the center of it all, still and composed, was me. I didn't change my behavior dramatically, no scenes, no ultimatums, no flaming emails laced with accusations, but I did become even more precise, more deliberate, and more unapologetically transactional. If Doug wanted a report, he got it, with exactly the information he asked for, no more, no less. If Ashley requested a meeting, I responded with available slots and made sure to CC her assistant, legal, and operations, just in case she forgot that her role, while fancy on paper, held no real authority. I stopped anticipating their needs. I stopped fixing problems they didn't know they had. And with each passing day, the gap between what they expected from me and what they actually received grew wider, until it was a chasm neither of them could cross without stumbling. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning during our quarterly strategic review, which was typically a glorified performance Doug hosted to reassure the senior leadership team that he was still in control. Normally, I sat quietly through these meetings, offering data when called upon, and biting my tongue whenever Ashley piped up with some ludicrous suggestion about brand positioning or interactive customer journeys. But this time, I didn't wait to be called on. As soon as Doug cleared his throat and started into his usual monologue, I interrupted, politely, professionally, but unmistakably, and presented my operations update before he even reached the first bullet point of his agenda. I laid out the recent performance metrics, noted the improvements since reallocating budget away from marketing and back into infrastructure, and detailed the consequences of several initiatives Ashley had launched that had yielded zero return on investment. I did this with a calm tone and a smile, like I was reading out weather conditions, Just facts, just numbers, just the results of decisions made and executed. Doug's face went red almost instantly, a combination of confusion, embarrassment, and I imagined the dawning realization that I no longer required, or even recognized, his permission to lead. He didn't say anything during the meeting. He just sat there with his jaw clenched, eyes darting between me and the screen. Ashley, for her part, looked like she had swallowed a lemon. When the room cleared out, Doug asked me to stay behind, and for a moment I considered whether or not I should. But then I thought, no, let's see what happens when he finally has to speak to the version of me that no longer fits into the box he built. He started with the usual deflection, accusing me of being cold, of undermining his authority, of turning the team against family cohesion, as if the dysfunction we were drowning in had anything to do with unity. I let him talk. I watched him spin himself into knots, trying to regain footing by shifting blame and rewriting history, until he finally said something that made everything snap into focus. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder, Olivia. You can't stand that she gets the attention without having to grind for it. That's what this is really about." That line, that tired narrative of jealousy, of sibling rivalry, of emotional fragility, that was what he thought this was all about. After everything, after all the hours I had poured into making his company run, after every fire I had put out before it reached his door, all he saw was the caricature he'd drawn of me when I was a teenager, who worked too hard to be noticed. I realized in that moment that he hadn't seen me as a professional in years, maybe ever. To him, I was still the girl desperate for his nod of approval, and Ashley was still the sunshine child who got praise just for being cute and charming and easy to love. I stood up, gathered my notes, and said, "You gave me a job. I made it a company." Then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I just walked back to my office, closed the door softly, and opened the legal folder I'd been assembling for weeks. I wasn't angry. I was ready. The next move came quickly. An internal audit I had requested 2 months earlier came back with findings that confirmed what I already suspected. Ashley had submitted expense reports for several vendor meetings that never occurred, including a weekend conference in Palm Springs that was actually a girls' trip documented in full on Instagram. I could have exposed her right away. I had the receipts, the timeline, the photos, everything, but I didn't send it to Doug. I didn't even confront her. I just passed it quietly to HR, flagged it for review, and made sure the finance team froze discretionary spending on her department. The panic spread fast. By Friday, Ashley was in my office with red-rimmed eyes, asking if I knew anything about her department's card being suspended. I looked her in the eye and said, "Not my department." And that was that. Later that afternoon, Doug sent a company-wide email that read like an apology but wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It talked about growing pains and realigning our values, as if the building wasn't already half on fire. I responded with my weekly report. Just numbers, just facts, no feelings, and in the background, quietly and with precision, the final phase of my plan began to take shape. Because sometimes you don't need to burn the house down. You just need to take your tools and leave, and let them figure out how to keep the roof from caving in. There's a certain kind of silence that follows a storm, not the peaceful kind people romanticize in books, but the brittle, hollow quiet that settles into the cracks left behind when something foundational has fractured. And as I sat in my office that Monday morning, sipping coffee that had long gone cold while watching the unread emails pile up in my inbox, I realized that this silence, unlike the one I had chosen weeks ago, wasn't mine. It belonged to them now, my father, my sister, the leadership team, the entire business that had for so long operated under the assumption that I would always be there to hold the wheel steady, to steer the ship when no one else was looking at the map. I had withdrawn just enough to show them what my absence felt like. And now, with the foundation buckling beneath their weight, they didn't know how to respond without me. What they didn't realize, what they had no way of knowing really, was that my silence had simply been the prelude. The real plan had been unfolding slowly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface, crafted in quiet conversations with lawyers, consultants, and a few very interested parties who had been circling our company for months, like sharks watching a boat that had sprung a leak. I had known for a long time that I couldn't stay. Not indefinitely, not while Doug refused to see me as anything more than the responsible older daughter who would always be there to clean up after his golden child. But I also knew I couldn't just leave, not like that. Not without leaving something behind that would finally force them to reckon with what they had lost. The trust was the first step. I'd spent years accumulating shares, not a majority, but enough to matter. And with the help of my legal team, I placed them into a trust I controlled. A neat little move that gave me the ability to shield them from sudden buyouts or panic decisions, while still positioning myself as the key decision maker in any major structural change. No one noticed. No one even asked. Doug had always been too focused on titles and flashy quarterly reports to pay attention to the quiet legal maneuverings that actually determined who held the cards. And Ashley, she was too busy trying to film corporate TikToks and design rebranded shipping labels to even read a shareholder report. They never saw it coming. When the offer came in from one of our largest competitors, a multi-state distribution conglomerate looking to expand into the Midwest, I was ready. They weren't proposing a hostile takeover, nothing aggressive or underhanded. They wanted a partnership. They wanted the systems I had built, the processes I had refined, the operational efficiency that had become our unspoken trademark. But they didn't want Doug. And they certainly didn't want Ashley. They wanted me, and for the first time I realized I wanted something more too. I walked into the board meeting that Friday dressed like I always had. Simple, professional, unassuming, no dramatic makeover, no grand entrance, just the same version of me they had always underestimated. Doug and Ashley were already there, whispering furiously in the corner of the conference room, faces tight with panic as they flipped through a report they clearly didn't understand. They had just found out about the frozen budgets, the internal investigations, and the dwindling vendor contracts that had begun redirecting elsewhere. The house of cards was trembling, and I was about to take the last one out. I stood at the head of the table and laid it all out, not as a threat, not as a final gotcha, but as a matter-of-fact business proposal. I explained the offer from the competitor, the terms of the acquisition, the projected profits, and the transition plan. I told them that the trust had already voted in favor, that I had accepted the role they'd offered me, Executive VP of Strategic Operations at the new firm, that I would be moving on. Doug looked like I'd slapped him. Ashley looked like she'd been pushed off a cliff. Neither spoke for several long seconds, as if trying to process a language they didn't understand. Then finally, Doug managed to say, "You'd sell us out? Your own family?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "I gave this family everything, and in return, I was treated like a backup plan. This isn't revenge, it's reality." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Favoritism isn't free. Someone always pays for it. I gathered my things. Just one small box with a framed photo of the warehouse crew, the only people in that building who had ever truly had my back. As I walked out, Ashley followed me to the parking lot. Her voice cracked when she said, "I didn't even want this job, you know." I turned to face her, really look at her, maybe for the first time without bitterness in my chest, and I said, "I know." I got into my car. The weight of it all sinking in, not as grief or anger, but as something quieter, closure maybe, or the slow, deep breath that follows finally coming up for air. My phone buzzed as I pulled out of the lot, and without even checking the screen, I knew who it was. I pressed play on the voicemail. It was Doug. His voice sounded older, cracked in places I'd never heard before. "Liv, I messed up. I should have said something sooner. You didn't deserve—" The message cut off there. I hit delete. I didn't need an apology, not anymore. What I needed, I had already taken. Not revenge in the explosive cinematic sense, but something far more satisfying. The power to walk away on my terms, leaving them to reckon with the silence they had created, the collapse they never saw coming, and the legacy I had built in the shadows of their indifference. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere down the line, they'll look back and realize that the quiet one was the only one who ever truly understood how to make the business survive. But by then, I'll be too far gone to care.